Welcome back to the Old West Tales, where every story whispers secrets of love, heartbreak, and redemption. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. Drop your location in the comments. I'm curious which part of the world my viewers are from. Sit back and let me take you on a journey that might just melt your heart tonight. The sound of chains, the crack of a whip, and then silence settled over the blistering Texas heat. Under the merciless sun, a young girl stood barefoot on a rough wooden platform, her wrists bound by rusted iron that had long since stained her skin. The crowd watched her with cold, measuring eyes, as if she were nothing more than livestock to be priced and discarded. The auctioneer wiped sweat from his neck and grinned, his voice cutting through the still air as he called out, "Next one, 17, no husband, no family, been sold 3 times already. Won't talk, won't work, $5 to start." Even years after the war had supposedly ended such practices, hidden auctions like this still lingered in the shadows, feeding on desperation and lawlessness. No one stepped forward. A man near the front spat into the dirt and muttered that she wasn't worth a dime. The girl remained motionless. Her name was Eliza Cartwright. Her torn dress clung to her thin frame, dust coating her skin, her tangled hair partially hiding the bruise darkening her cheek. She stared at the ground, empty and unmoving, as if whatever part of her once felt fear or sorrow had long since been worn away. Then a voice broke through the silence, calm and steady. "I'll pay 20. Heads turned. At the back of the crowd stood a man in a worn brown coat, holding a few crumpled bills. His name was Caleb Turner, a man of 56 with gray stubble lining his jaw and a face that hadn't known a real smile in years. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. 20? You sure about that? Caleb gave a single nod. The gavel struck hard. Sold. Eliza didn't react. She didn't look up, didn't move, didn't acknowledge what had just happened. Caleb stepped forward, removing his hat as he approached. The moment he saw her face clearly, something inside him stopped cold. There on her wrist was a small crescent-shaped scar. He remembered it instantly. 8 years ago, when she was just a child hiding behind her father, asking if the wound would leave a mark. He had told her no. He had lied. The auctioneer shoved her forward carelessly, but Caleb caught her before she could fall. Her skin burned with fever as she looked up at him for the first time, her green eyes hollow and distant. "Eliza," he whispered. There was a flicker in her gaze, something buried deep, but it vanished just as quickly. If she recognized him, she gave no sign. People like her had learned not to trust familiar faces. Outside, the wind carried the echo of another gavel strike. Another life sold. Another soul taken. Caleb paid the last of his money and led her away without another word, stepping out into the harsh light with the girl who had forgotten how to speak. The dirt road stretched endlessly ahead beneath the blazing sky. Eliza followed a few steps behind him, the chains at her wrists clinking softly with each step. Every sound reminded him of what he owed, though he doubted she would ever understand why he had done it. Maybe she never would. As the barn door slammed shut behind them, the past seemed to rise up like a shadow at his back. 8 years earlier, his father's greed had destroyed her family, and now the last piece of that family walked beside him, silent, broken, and alive. The sun dipped lower as they moved on, dust swirling around their feet. Caleb knew the truth would catch up with him eventually, but he had no idea how to ask forgiveness from someone who didn't even know who he was anymore. After a while, he stopped the horses and reached into his pocket for a key. Without a word, he unlocked the chains binding her wrists. "No one should wear these in a free country," he muttered, thinking bitterly of the promises made after the war. They continued on, riding slowly beneath the punishing sun, Eliza silent on the smaller horse behind him. He could feel her fear without her saying a word. Every time he glanced back, her eyes were fixed on the ground, never meeting his. When they reached the shade of a large oak tree, he dismounted and tied the horses, then pulled a canteen from his saddlebag. Approaching carefully, he held it out. "Here," he said softly. She hesitated, watching him like a cornered animal, then slowly took it, her fingers trembling. She drank cautiously, as if expecting the kindness to vanish at any moment. After a single sip, she wiped her mouth and finally looked at him. "Guess you got what you paid for," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "Do what you want." The words hit harder than he expected. Caleb froze, then slowly knelt so she could see his empty hands. "I didn't buy you to own you," he said. "I just didn't want to see them sell you again." She gave a dry, bitter laugh. "You think that makes it better?" He had no answer. Silence stretched between them again, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally he spoke. "I knew your family. Your father was a good man. I should have done more." Eliza turned away. "Everyone says that when it's too late," she replied flatly. The wind rustled the branches above as she stood and walked back to her horse. Caleb didn't stop her. He simply watched, knowing he had earned every bit of her anger. When they resumed their journey, the sound of hooves echoed across the hills, steady and hollow. He wondered how long it would take for her to stop seeing him as the enemy, or if she ever would. And beneath it all, one question burned. What would happen when she learned the truth? By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was slipping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the quiet land. The place felt isolated, almost forgotten, as if even the wind had grown tired of passing through it. Caleb untied the horses, handed Eliza a small piece of bread, and gestured toward the cabin. "Inside," he said simply. She hesitated at the doorway, her eyes scanning the single bed, the cold stove, and the bare wooden walls. Then she stepped in slowly, cautiously, like something wild testing whether it was safe. The first few days passed in silence. Eliza worked without being told, feeding the horses, hauling water, scrubbing the floor until her hands cracked from effort. Caleb kept to himself, fixing fences, patching the roof, and pretending not to watch her too closely. They lived like strangers bound by circumstance, two ghosts sharing the same empty ground. But silence, especially in a place like that, never stayed unbroken for long. On the third day, dust rose along the road leading to the ranch. Caleb saw it before he heard the horses, the faint shimmer of movement beneath the harsh sun. As the riders drew closer, the glint of a badge caught the light. Marshal Briggs rode at the front, a man who wore authority like armor and cruelty like a habit. He had once called himself a keeper of justice, though Caleb knew better. This was the same man who had led the raid that burned the Cartwright farm to the ground. Briggs dismounted slowly, a smirk spreading across his face as his boots hit the dirt. "Well now, if it ain't Caleb Turner," he drawled. His gaze slid past Caleb and settled on Eliza, who stood stiffly behind the fence. His eyes narrowed slightly when he noticed a scar on her wrist. For a brief moment, his expression shifted, recognition flickering beneath the surface. "Now that's a face I didn't expect to see again." Eliza froze, her grip tightening on the wooden rail until her knuckles turned white. Caleb stepped forward, placing himself firmly between her and the marshal. "You've seen enough," he said quietly. Briggs chuckled, the sound low and mocking. "What's this? You buying lost girls now? Or is she here to keep you company?" Caleb didn't react, but the air grew heavier, thick with tension. "I paid for freedom," he replied evenly, "not her body." Briggs took a slow step closer, his hand resting casually near his gun. "That's so," he said. "Funny thing is, I remember that name, Cartwright. Her daddy was a traitor, if I recall." The lie rolled off his tongue easily, just as it had years ago when he used it to justify taking their land in the chaos after the war. Eliza's breath hitched as the memory of fire and smoke flashed through her mind, but she said nothing. Silence had kept her alive this long. Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's under my protection," he said. Briggs laughed again, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a single bullet. He placed it carefully on the fence post between them. "Just a reminder," he said softly, "some things don't stay buried." Without another word, he mounted his horse and rode off, the others following behind him. The dust they left behind felt heavier than before, like a warning settling over the land. Eliza stepped forward slowly and picked up the bullet, turning it over in her hand. "Who was that?" she asked quietly. Caleb didn't answer. Not yet. He simply stared out toward the horizon, knowing this wasn't over. When Briggs returned, and there would be blood. That night, the wind howled harder than usual, carried with it the scent of rain, and something older, something buried deep in memory. Caleb sat near the small fire inside the cabin, the flickering light casting shadows along the walls. Eliza sat across from him, silent as always, her face half hidden in darkness. Since the marshal's visit, neither of them had spoken, but the silence between them felt different now. Heavier, charged with everything left unsaid. After a long while, Eliza reached into her pocket and placed something on the table between them. A small silver pocket watch, worn with age, the faint initials RC carved into its back. She pushed it toward him. "Recognize it?" she asked. Caleb's hand froze. He knew it instantly. It had belonged to her father. "I found it after the raid," she said. "I kept it hidden all these years. It was the last thing he gave me." Her voice softened slightly. "He told me to keep it safe." She looked up at him then, her eyes sharp but glistening with something deeper. "You knew him," she said. "So, tell me the truth. What really happened that night?" Caleb stared into fire for a long time before speaking. The flames twisted and flickered, like memories refusing to stay still. "My father sold your family out," he said finally. "He wanted their land. I overheard him and tried to warn them, but I got there too late. Everything was already burning." His voice dropped. "I did nothing." Eliza didn't move. Her hand closed tightly around the watch, as if holding on to the last piece of something that no longer existed. "You think telling me this changes anything?" she asked. "No," he admitted, "but you deserve the truth." Silence settled again, broken only by the crackle of fire and the distant rumble of thunder. After a while, she spoke again, her voice quieter now. "If your father did all that, why are you the one carrying the guilt?" Caleb looked up, his expression steady but worn. "Because I was there," he said. "Because I lived." Something shifted in her eyes then, not forgiveness, not yet, but something less rigid than before. The anger hadn't disappeared, but it had cracked just enough to let something else through. Before either of them could say more, the sound of hooves cut through the storm outside, fast and close. Caleb's hand went instantly to his gun, because some things, no matter how much time passes, never stay in the past. The sound of hooves faded as quickly as it had come, swallowed by the storm until only the rain and the crackle of the dying fire remained. Caleb stood near the door, his gun still in hand, eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Eliza sat by the hearth, the silver watch clenched tightly in her fingers. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer sharp with anger, but heavy with truth be why mourning. The storm had passed. The sky stretched wide and clean above the land, sunlight spilling gently across the ranch. Caleb stepped outside and began repairing a section of broken fence, his movement steady, his body aching from years of labor and regret. He didn't hear Eliza approach until she spoke from behind him. "You're doing it wrong." Her voice was dry, almost teasing. He turned, surprised to find her standing there, holding a hammer, her hair loose and her clothes still slightly damp from the night before. Without waiting for an answer, she stepped forward and began working beside him. They spent hours repairing the fence together, saying little. The rhythm of hammering wood and tightening wire filled the quiet space between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close, something steady and real. That evening, Caleb took a piece of wood and began carving, his hands slow and deliberate. By dusk, 2 simple crosses stood near the edge of property, one bearing the name Robert Cartwright, the other marked only with the word family. When Eliza saw them, something inside her finally broke. She walked to the crosses, knelt down, and traced the carved letters with trembling fingers. Tears filled her eyes, tears she had held back for years, through pain, loss, and survival. After a long while, she stood and returned to Caleb. Without a word, she placed the silver watch back into his hand. "I think it's time you keep it," she said softly. He shook his head. "It belongs to them." A faint, tired smile touched her lips. "Then let it stay here," she replied. That night, she didn't sleep by the door as she had before. Instead, she sat near the window, watching the stars, while Caleb remained across the room, feeling for the first time in years that he could breathe without the weight of the past crushing him. Days turned into weeks, and Eliza stayed. She began to mend clothes, plant seeds, and slowly bring life back to the worn-out land. She laughed once, just a small sound, barely there, but it was enough to change something in the air. Caleb found himself working with a lighter heart, no longer haunted every moment by what had been lost. The ranch began to feel like something more than a place to hide. It became a place to rebuild. Trust didn't come all at once. It grew slowly, like grass pushing through burned earth, quiet, persistent, and strong. Eliza still carried her scars, and Caleb still carried his guilt, but they no longer faced those burdens alone. Sometimes they spoke about small things, the weather, the work, the land. Other times, they said nothing at all, and that silence felt just as meaningful. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of gold and red, Eliza stood beside Caleb near the fence line. The crosses stood behind them, simple but no longer lonely. She looked out over the land, then turned to him. "You can't change what happened," she said quietly. Caleb didn't respond, but he listened. "But you stayed," she continued. "Most people wouldn't." He glanced at her, unsure what to say. She met his gaze, her expression steady. That has to mean something. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, but it was a beginning of it. And sometimes beginnings were enough. In the days that followed, the past still lingered at the edges of their lives, especially with the shadow of Marshall Briggs hanging over them. They both knew he would return eventually, but now the fear didn't feel the same. It wasn't faced alone anymore. The ranch changed with the seasons. Where there had once been only silence and decay, there was now movement, purpose, and something resembling peace. Eliza was no longer the silent girl on the auction block, and Caleb was no longer just a man running from his past. Together, they had begun to carve out something new, a fragile but honest future built on truth, endurance, and the slow, difficult path toward forgiveness. Because sometimes healing doesn't come in a single moment. It doesn't arrive with grand words or sudden clarity. Sometimes it comes quietly, in shared work, in small acts of kindness, in the courage to stay when it would be easier to walk away. And sometimes in the wildest, harshest places, two broken souls find a way to rebuild, not just a home, but themselves. I love all of you, my wonderful audience of Wild West Tales. Tell me how this story made you feel. Leave a comment below. Type 1 if you love this story. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic tales from the wild.